The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
What is the impact of just one corporation owning all the major sports teams in Ontario's capital city? Also, correcting one of Major League Baseball's historic wrongs. That's all tonight on The Agenda. Quick now, what do the following Toronto sports teams have in common? The hockey, Leafs. The basketball, Raptors. Baseball's, Blue Jays. Soccer's, Toronto FC. Hockey's, Marlies. And the football Argonauts? Answer? Rogers now owns them all. What does that mean for the communications juggernaut? And more importantly, for those of us who expend too much emotional energy cheering for those teams? Let's find out from Alexandra Posadsky. She is author of Rogers versus Rogers, The Battle for Control of Canada's Telecom Empire. She's also a financial and cybercrime reporter with the Globe and Mail. Barbara Schechter, senior business correspondent at the Financial Post. And Tim Dewhurst. He's a professor of marketing and public policy in the Gordon S. Lang School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph and definitely wins the prize for having the most difficulty getting here today. That's a long haul. GO train, TDC train, and here you are. Brilliant.
There I am.
Thank you, Tim. And great to have you guys here as well. Appreciate you being here. Sheldon, graphic off the top, if you would, please, because we want to remind everybody here of what Rogers did not too long ago to become the undisputed kings of the Toronto sports scene. Here we go. They spent $4.7 billion to buy out Bell's 37.5% stake in Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. They now own 75% of MLSE, and that, of course, means Leafs, Raptors, Toronto FC, Argonauts, Marlies, don't forget Scotiabank Arena, NBA TV, and they already own the Blue Jays and the Rogers Centre. So they own everything, basically. Okay, Alexandra, start us off. Tell us why this deal made sense for Rogers.
Well, as you've mentioned, since they already own the Blue Jays, they're now essentially consolidating their ownership position in all of the city's most valuable sports franchises. And so what that could mean is potentially in the future, they could spin those properties out through an IPO and then perhaps actually see the value of some of those sports teams reflected in their own stock price.
Barbara, what would you add to that about why this makes sense for Rogers?
Well, that was a pretty complete answer. I think that is why they went for it. They've owned the Toronto Blue Jays, though, for some 20 plus years. And I think that is really key. They never really feel that they got recognition for owning that sports franchise in their share price. And doing this deal will, as Alex said, consolidate those teams and sort of hopefully surface that value.
So at the end of the day, it's about improving the share price of Rogers.
Well, I think everything Rogers does, bottom line, is probably about improving their share price.
I'm not saying that critically. I'm saying, but that's it's not a love of hockey or love of basketball or whatever.
Well, I think they clearly showed that they had some interest in sports, in 2000, and it's a way of, they've just sort of struggled to get recognition for that. So you don't want to own something that is not being recognized. You want sort of the sum to be worth, at least the parts.
Gotcha. Tim, how about you?
Well, I mean, with this deal, they'll have a sports monopoly with Toronto, but then also it's important to keep in mind that the Toronto Blue Jays and the Toronto Raptors are Canada's only representation in those professional sport leagues. So the region is actually the entire country with those particular teams. I think one other thing is that there's been escalating broadcast deals, and I think they're assuming with this deal that it's going to continue to escalate in terms of, the financial sort of decision-making behind this deal.
We do have to remember that. I mean, we sometimes get tunnel vision sitting here in the province of Ontario that there are lots of Blue Jay fans in British Columbia. And when the Blue Jays are in Seattle, they descend on the place and they make Seattle a home game for the Toronto Blue Jays. So yeah, their region is not Toronto and environs. It's the whole country, isn't it?
It's very true. I've been one of those fans that's actually seen a game in Seattle when Toronto's playing, and it's kind of amusing to see because Seattle will, if their pitcher's throwing to first base to hold a runner, the crowd starts booing, the Seattle team.
So it's a bit of a home game for the Blue Jays.
Very much so.
Even when it's in a different country. That's
Yes.
really quite funny. Okay, other side of the coin. obviously Rogers had a willing partner in Bell, which needed to sell its 37.5% stake of MLSE. Why did Bell, do that?
Yeah, so need is a strong word, but they certainly were incentivized to sell because, of course, Bell has a lot of debt they've borrowed in order to build out 5G, build out fiber in their copper territory. And so they have, a lot of debt on the balance sheet, and doing this allows them to pay down some of that debt in a time when, we have still elevated interest rates. And, the alternative, which is cutting the dividend, is simply not an option for Bell because they're so widely held as a dividend stock.
Can I get you on that, Barbara? Was Bell ever really in danger of reducing the dividend in order to deal with its other financial issues?
Well, they did get busted down to just, I think, a notch above junk status on some of their bonds. So that's pretty serious for a corporation. And so I think I'm not sure how quickly the dividend would have been in danger, but that's not a good sign. So, and they have been making a habit of getting rid of some of their non-core assets. So this fits with that. The timing, Rogers probably saw that, and the timing was good.
Tim, the Bell angle, what do you think?
I agree with what's just been said. It was certainly a way to deal with accumulating debt. And actually, it's ended up being a very good investment because it was under $1 billion in terms of when they first had an ownership stake in Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, and now getting a $4.7 billion. There's been a pretty nice return on that.
No kidding. Do we know, well, let me start it this way. These were two intensely competing against one another entities, which somehow, I guess, were somewhat strange bedfellows, co-owning in equal measure one of the crown jewels in all of professional sports, a few of the crown jewels in all of professional sports. Do we know how amicably, Alexandra, the decision to enter negotiations and split up, how those negotiations went?
What we do know is that the talks have been kind of ongoing for some time. So this has been in the making for months, but it's all happening, in closed rooms. So we don't really know how amicable. I've also often wondered what those conversations around the MLSE boardroom table look like because, we've got Bell, we've got Rogers, and then of course we've also got Larry Tannenbaum owning a stake of MLSE. And one of the things that I had heard from sources in reporting my book was that Edward and Larry famously do not get along.
Hang on, Edward Rogers, the boss,
That's
the big
right.
guy, and Larry Tannenbaum, you say famously don't get along.
That is what I have been told, is that, they often had disagreements around the boardroom.
Okay, so we've got to remember all the details here. Bell and MLSE own 75% of the team, of the outfit, MLSE.
Right.
Larry Tannenbaum owned 25%, and none of the three partners particularly liked the arrangement or each other?
Well, I think in the shareholders arrangement that they had crafted in 2012, when that partnership came together, the three parties you just mentioned, they did have an agreement where Rogers and Bell, BCE, had to be in agreement for anything to move forward. Mm-hmm. So that sounds good in theory, but also that means things can't move forward if those two didn't agree. So it was an odd boardroom for sure, the way it was structured. So again, it is behind closed doors. We don't know exactly how it looked, but a lot was made of Larry Tannenbaum going outside the partnership to bring in the WNBA, the women's team. Did not happen through MLSE. So the entity that Rogers and Bell are part of. So it definitely seemed like it wasn't the smoothest of boardrooms.
That's interesting. We have to remember that as well. That's right. Larry Tannenbaum, on his own, brought the Women's National Basketball Association team to Toronto. What are they called? The Scepters? Is that what they're No, that's the hockey team. What's the WNBA team going to be called? Maybe they haven't got.
I'm not sure.
Maybe they haven't got a name yet, or do they? If anybody in the control room remembers, I don't remember right now. Anyways, what does that tell you about how amicably these three elements got on?
Well, it was a strange arrangement for sure. Certainly with Rogers now having a 75% stake, and then my understanding is that also they, within 2 years, have the opportunity to buy out Larry Tannenbaum's controlling interest. So they definitely are seeking to push him out, and he's been very much the face with a lot of decision making with Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. And certainly it is an opportunity for Rogers and Edward Rogers in particular to exert or a lot of control.
I am told by my good friends in the control room that we are not all losing our minds out here or forgetful. They haven't got a name yet for the WNBA team, which is why we can't think of it.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Rogers just bought Shaw for $20 billion plus. That's a lot of money. Why did they think that they could afford to spend almost another $5 billion buying out Bell?
Well, I think the opportunity presented itself, and they've been pretty clear with the market that they are not going to sort of, ram more debt down the throats of shareholders. They're going to sell down some of the acquired stake to private investors. We don't know a lot about those. We're doing a little reporting on that, but ultimately they may only own 51%, and that sale to those, or bringing in some outside private investors who I'm told may have shares but not votes, will sort of make sure that Rogers does not take on extraordinary debt and may in fact pay for this buyout of the stake in MLSE.
Private outside investors means what exactly?
That's what we're trying to find out. But I think people that would like to put money forward to have a piece of this, but don't necessarily want to be sort of in that boardroom scenario where they're making decisions. They want a piece. So they are the money men.
And my understanding is that the longer that it takes for them to get approval, because of course this deal requires the approval of regulators, two regulators in particular, the longer it takes for them to get that approval, the more of MLSE Rogers will get to hold on to, because they're busy paying down debt on the Shaw deal currently, and they're selling some of their non-core assets like real estate holdings. And so if they have more time, then they won't necessarily have to sell off as much of MLSE.
Can you just follow up on that? The notion that two different Canadian regulators, I gather the Competition Bureau and the CRTC, the Radio Television Telecommunications Commission, or whatever is that what they call it
The
still?
Canadian Radio Television Telecommunications Commission.
Commission, right. The fact that they have to give the good housekeeping seal of approval to this deal, why? Why do they have, what's their interest in this?
So the CRTC is the telecom and broadcasting regulator. They have to approve it because of the transfer of broadcasting licenses. And then the Competition Bureau basically has to convince itself that there's not going to be a lessening of competition. Anyone who's followed the Rogers-Shaw deal will know that the Competition Bureau actually attempted to block that merger. They had claimed that it would lead to a lessening of competition, and they lost that case in front of the Competition Tribunal. So we do know that we have a feisty Competition Bureau. I don't know whether that means they're going to challenge this merger or not.
Well, let me ask Tim that. Do you have any reason to believe, as you look at this thing, that either of those two entities might put thumbs down on this?
I don't anticipate that they will, but I think they should give it very careful scrutiny and careful consideration, just because we've seen in Canada a lot of instances where there's been concerns about the market concentration power. The grocery sector is one area that's gotten a lot of attention. Ticketmaster is also another area in the entertainment sector that's got a lot of attention. And certainly there is concern because not only is Rogers essentially getting a monopoly on sports in Toronto, but they also are the owner of Sportsnet. And so there's also the issue of broadcasting rights with all those sport teams.
Having said that, Barbara, Rogers is saying all the right things at this stage, namely that, of course we're not going to shut out TSN, which would be their Bell rival. Of course we're going to sell them the rights to broadcast Leaf games or Raptors games if they come forward with a good offer. So does the Competition Bureau or the CRTC have a dog in this hunt?
I've made predictions on such things before, and it's kind of like Ted Rogers' record on politics, which we talked about earlier. I haven't always made the right call, so I don't want to try to get in front of that because it really depends. I mean, it is a feisty commissioner of competition. Sometimes he picks a fight that people don't expect him to pick. And you did point out that they've tried to do the right things by saying that the broadcast rights for 20 years will be, available to Bell. So we really won't know until we know. And we were surprised. Some people were surprised at the Rogers-Shaw challenge, and especially how long it went on after they came up with a solution to create more competition in wireless.
Gotcha. Okay, let's talk basketball for a second here. Does anybody remember what the Raptors cost 30 years ago? Did I remember the number?
I think you do.
I just so happen to have looked it up here.
I think it was 1994 as an expansion team.
Expansion franchise, that's right, was worth $125 million for the original ownership group to buy into the NBA. $125 million. Now, based on the buyout of what Rogers just paid for 37.5% of the NBA franchise here in Toronto, do you know what the Raptors are worth now? From $125 million to $4 billion. And apparently the league is about to charge $5 billion for new potential expansion franchises in Vegas and Seattle. We used to have an expression in television, it's a license to print money. Is it?
Well, it certainly seems that way, even if you look at the MLSE deal now, when the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan sold out in 2012, I was speaking to someone who was around in those days, talking about a cocktail party in which teachers was asked, why are you selling? And they said, oh, we think that asset's tapped out. They've made a lot of money, but I think that was around $1 billion that they sold their 75, or it was more than 75% stake for, I think, at that time. So, yeah, these things have definitely gone up in value. I've asked people about that, like, why are these teams going for record amounts? And there seem to be, the things that are said are digital rights. There's so many, your phone and everywhere where they can sort of, it's not just buying a ticket anymore or, some beer at the game. Like, there are so many different sort of avenues beyond even the broadcasting rights that were available, and around and being talked about in 2012. There are all kinds of new outlets. There's the prestige of owning a team. That's sort of always been the case, but it seems to have gotten a bigger multiple in some of these deals recently. And maybe some other folks can offer some other reasons why they think these things are appreciating in value so much.
The one that I'll add is just that sports is still one of the things that you need to watch live. Right, and so those broadcasting rights are still really, really valuable. Whereas, things like TV shows, like we're streaming that all now, and so that's really hit the cable TV model.
What would you call a business, Tim, that is worth $125 million one day and $4 billion a few decades later?
Very successful.
No kidding. Yeah, that's pretty good. It means the buyout price for MLSE is $12.5 billion. $12.5 billion. Where does that number put MLSE in the kind of pantheon of sports ownership groups around North America?
Pretty much at the top. And so, especially considering the collection of teams that are involved, it pretty much puts it at the top.
Do you have a view on why the stuff seems to be... I always have been told by people in this business, you've got to make a distinction between how much money the teams make as profit themselves through operations versus the value of the franchise itself. I've been told by so many people over the years, our teams actually don't make that much money and can lose a lot of money, and Toronto FC, the soccer team, is losing dozens of millions of dollars a year right now, and yet the value of the franchises themselves goes up all the time. Can you explain that?
Well, I can make an attempt.
Okay.
The Blue Jays apparently also have been losing money over the last number of years, and Rogers is continue to fund them. So I think that the teams themselves, a lot of times it's the player salaries, from my understanding, that make the losses, right? That lead to the losses because they have to pay so much to the players. But that you can look at the team itself, like the baseball team or the soccer team, and then you look at all the surrounding contributions from the broadcast rights. I understand there's even money in fantasy sports leagues. Yeah. So you can, if you isolate just the team and how much it costs to run and pay the players, that can be losing money. But the whole franchise, if you call it that, all the ancillary revenues, it actually may not be losing money. But on things like, I know Rogers doesn't break out the Blue Jays. So you don't see really what the numbers are, but you see what some of the executives have talked about publicly about losing money since the pandemic and the cost of player salaries. So you do have some sort of insights into that, but I think that might be part of it, is it's beyond just the team and the players.
Well, I remember Paul Beeston, who was, I guess, the first ever employee of the Toronto Blue Jays, who was a chartered accountant in his real life, saying, yeah, we made $2 million last year for the Blue Jays. Now, with moving a couple of periods and commas and so on, I can make that look like a $2 million loss. So this kind of stuff is somewhat flexible here, I gather. Tell me this, Alex, does the fact that all of the revenue comes in Canadian dollars, but the fact that they have to pay all the players in American dollars, you would think that would be a huge problem for a Canadian-based team. It does not seem to be. Why not?
I mean, that is a great question, but as Barb pointed out, we don't see the breakout of how the Blue Jays are doing. So it would be really interesting if they do end up putting all these assets together into one sort of sports empire and spin it out, then maybe we could actually kind of get a look under the hood and see exactly what's happening there and why.
Yeah. Tim, you got something on that?
Sure. I mean, the escalating value of a lot of these teams is a reflection of escalating broadcast deals. And so it's become more and more competitive where now you have Amazon Prime, Apple, and a lot of these streaming platforms that have entered into broadcast deals. And even Netflix now has a deal with the NFL to broadcast two games on Christmas Day. Huh. And so these kind of deals have generate a lot of revenue. And then the additional thing has been there's been more and more expansion teams in a lot of the professional leagues. And so the Raptors, when there's an expansion fee of up to $5 billion, as you presented earlier, the Raptors will get a cut of that. And
they'll get 1/30th or 1/31st or whatever it is.
Precisely, yeah.
Of that money. Fabulous. Okay. Barbara, how about this? We need to put this deal into some kind of historical context here. Once upon a time, I used to work for Ted Rogers 40 plus years ago, and he was a telecommunications guy back then, and that was it. Telecommunications, cable TV, that's the business he was in. Rogers is now a sports behemoth. In terms of helping us understand the arc of the company better, paint us a picture.
Well, I mean, I think the thing for me that sort of encapsulates that is a time I went to the Skybox, I think it was called then, the corporate box that Rogers had at what was then the Skydome probably. Yeah. So you can see what the era was. I think it was probably shortly after they bought 100% of the Jays, which was in 2004. And it was one of the rare times I was actually at the game because my dad had tickets he wasn't using. And so I was invited to the Rogers box because Ted was going to be there. So I went up, and my recollection is a lot of the Rogers executives were clearly into sports, and they would sit in the seats at the front the entire game. And if you want to talk to them, you'd have to go sit down with them and look at the field. But the whole time I was in the box, Ted had his back to the game and to the field. And the time he really lit up was when he sort of pulled, which I'm not sure if this was a prototype or just an early smartphone, pulled it out of his pocket, and he was talking about how you're going to be watching TV shows on this. Like, he was very rooted still in, cable carries television to your home.
How many years ago was this?
I can't date it, but it was after.
Probably 20.
It was after, it was after 2004, and it was probably somewhere in the mids, somewhere around there, like maybe 2007. And he was saying, you're going to be watching TV shows on this, and I'm like, okay, Ted, kind of like, and all the entertainment was going to be, it wasn't just going to come in through the cable into your home on your television. And what I find interesting about that and the evolution is that he wasn't wrong, but also the sort of application of all the digital, the way sports has transformed and the way people are constantly on their phones, either playing fantasy sports or looking at the scores or, following along, and all the streaming that's come from that. So they already owned the Jays. I don't know if they knew what it was going to become or they could predict. They didn't own any of the other teams through Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment at that time because it would have been pre-2012. So I think that's been the evolution. Like he had the idea and he saw how it fit, even though he wasn't really paying attention to what the content was behind him.
I had one of those conversations with him once as well, where he was, this is 40 years ago, he's sitting down at a lunch table trying to explain what fiber optic cable was to me, which of course I had no clue about, but he sure did. He sure figured that one out. Okay, you've written a book on this company. Talk to us about the arc of its history, leading it to become a sports behemoth today.
Yeah, so I love the anecdote that Barbara just told us, because the really fascinating thing about Ted was when Ted bought the Blue Jays, he saw the value of the Blue Jays before he really even understood the rules of baseball. So one of the stories that I was told was that at one point he was flying to the press conference with his doctor, Dr. Bernie Gossovitz, or Dr. G as he's known, and he asks Dr. G, can you explain the rules to me? And so Dr. G draws a diagram and he's explaining to him on the flight how baseball works. And then he gets up to the podium and then it's like he's been following the game his whole life because he was just such a bright person. So after they bought the Blue Jays, well, they bought an 80% stake at first, and then 4 years later, that was in 2000, 4 years later, they bought the remaining 20%. They ended up buying the Sky Dome for $25 million, basically the price of a standalone house in Toronto these days. And then,
can you imagine? The dome was what, $1 billion to build? Maybe 650 million. I might be exaggerating a bit. Anyway, and he bought it for 25 million.
25, and then he put another 25 million in for renovations. And then it wasn't until 2011 when Nadir Mohammed was the CEO that Rogers ended up buying with Bell a stake in MLSE that the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan was divesting. And we saw an article in Toronto Life quite a few years ago now that actually said that at that time Edward and presumably also his sister Melinda were disappointed because they wanted Rogers to get the entire stake, but Nadir Mohammed at that time, he didn't want to shell out the money that teachers was asking for it.
This may be an odd question, Tim, but we are accustomed to, you think of the great owners in sports. George Steinbrenner of the New York Yankees. I don't say great because he had any success, but Harold Ballard at least was a hockey fan. He loved hockey. He went to all the games. He cared about hockey. His name's on the Stanley Cup from the '67 Leafs. Ted Rogers clearly was not a sports fan. I don't know that Edward Rogers is much of a sports fan, actually. I don't know that he cares that much about it. Does that matter?
Well, I guess it matters in that he's going to now have control of decision-making of who the president of operations for the various teams are. And so, I don't know how much it matters per se, but he's still very important in decision-making of who will be making the important decisions for each of the various teams.
Alexander, does it matter if the person who holds the strings actually doesn't know the difference between a home run and a stolen base?
I mean, I think my understanding is that Edward is certainly more of a sports fan than his father was.
That's not saying much.
It's not. He does go to games. He is the chairman of the Blue Jays. When the Raptors won the NBA championships, he did celebrate by buying NBA championship rings for all the Rogers board members. So it seems that he is at least somewhat engaged in sports. I think from the fans' perspective, fans would love it if he were very excited about sports because they want to see MLSE shelling out for the salaries for the players that are needed in order to win, essentially.
Let me pick up on that angle here, because if you go to a Los Angeles Clippers basketball game in L.A., Steve Ballmer is on the microphone. He's jacked. He is talking to the fans. He is out there. Mark Cuban, Dallas Mavericks, same thing. He is a presence at the game. There are a lot of owners like that in other sports. Edward Rogers is a very introverted guy who is not going to be, giving high fives to fans as he runs up the steps to the seats. Does that matter?
Well, I think what will matter most is whether they're willing to sort of, pay the salaries and do all that kind of thing that you talked about. And I think they've shown that they are willing to do that. That even though they're, a for-profit business, they've been allowing the Jays, which they have full control over, to apparently pay out big salaries and lose money. So I think the key thing for the teams, and again, I come at this from not a sports person, I think the important thing is that they're going to get the funding, because whoever you give it to, I think they're a bit hamstrung in sports from the little I understand about it. If they can't, outbid others for the players and things like that, Tim can probably answer this better.
Well, to the small, tiny extent that I follow baseball, which is to say I spend way too much time on it, the Blue Jays are the fourth highest paid team in Major League Baseball out of the 30 teams, fourth highest, and they came last this year. So payroll has not been the problem. Tim.
Yeah, well, they were last in their division. The Chicago White Sox were worse,
Yes.
even worse. But no, it was very disappointing with the year-end press conference that they had where upper management, Shapiro and Atkins, were speaking to the media and fans about the season that was. And what was very disappointing is they seemed quite tone deaf about the fans' frustration of where, going into this season, they were very much with ambition of making the playoffs and being very competitive. But this year, after the season, they said, we hope to play meaningful September baseball. They weren't even with the ambition next year of trying to make the playoffs. They just want to be playing meaningful baseball in September while the regular season is still going on.
Does it sound to you like they've lowered the bar on the objective?
Very much so. And as a fan, personally as a fan of the Blue Jays, that was very disappointing to hear that we seemingly have lowered the bar of what the ambition and what they're trying to achieve.
But let's just understand this, because agreed, the sports fans want to know, now that there's one clear owner, and we don't have this sort of three-headed horse of division of ownership anymore. There's one clear owner of every Toronto sports team. Does that theoretically make it easier to make decisions, and therefore, if you make the right decisions, end up with better teams? That's what we want to know.
Well, I think there'll be more efficiency in terms of the boardroom, that the fact that there aren't sort of the different competing interests. But no, I don't think that translates into necessarily a winning team. We look at the Blue Jays as an example of where they haven't had much success in recent years. Yeah, it's certainly not a guarantee. And then the concern, too, is that if you have a sports monopoly in Toronto, I mean, typically with a monopoly, you see escalating prices. So the fan experience is likely to be diminished, where you have higher prices, less value, I guess, in going to see a live game. And also with monopolies, often you see there's less incentive to innovate, when there's lacking competition. And so as long as the Toronto Maple Leafs are the number one team, according to Forbes, in terms of valuation in the NHL, and they have escalated prices and revenue coming in, there isn't really incredible pressure to necessarily win the Stanley Cup.
That's Alexander, you're going to get the last word on this, and that's what I need to know. Now that the Toronto Maple Leafs are owned by one corporation, as opposed to what they had in the past, does that guarantee we will have a Stanley Cup parade down Bay Street next June?
Definitely not.
It doesn't guarantee
no
that?
Guarantee.
Oh, so disappointed. I mean, isn't that why we're doing this deal in the first place? So we get a Stanley Cup parade in June?
Well, I think we'd all love one, but I don't know that that's necessarily the primary motivation here.
I don't know if the people in Ottawa or Windsor would love that as much as we would here. They may be cheering for other teams. Anyways, gang, thanks so much for coming from near and far to join us today. Barbara Schechter, Senior Business Correspondent, Financial Post, and Tim Dewhurst from the University of Guelph, and Alexandra Posadsky, Canada. Boy, that was a great book. I want to remember we had you in for that. Rogers versus Rogers, the battle for control of Canada's telecom empire. Great to have you all here at TVO tonight. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
One of the joys of following sports is trying to remember endless reams of numbers, and no sport loves its statistics more than Major League Baseball. Babe Ruth's 714 career home runs, Lou Gehrig's 23 career grand slams, Ty Cobb's 4,189 career hits. But baseball's dirty little secret has been that all of those records were achieved by and against white players only. Until Jackie Robinson's arrival in 1947, baseball banned players of color. But something extraordinary happened this season, a new attempt to right the wrongs of history. And Bob Kendrick, the president of the Negro League's Baseball Museum, joins us now from Kansas City, Missouri for more. Mr. Kendrick, a great pleasure to have you on our program. How are you doing today?
Man, I am doing great. It is great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Not at all. I think we need a bit of a history lesson first, though. While Babe and Lou were setting their Major League records, where did the greatest black baseball players of that day play?
They played in the Negro Leagues. they created a league of their own. And Steve, that league was established right here in Kansas City, right around the corner from where my office resides here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum. The old Paseo YMCA is where Andrew Roop Foster led a contingent of 8 independent black baseball team owners into Kansas City. They met there and on February 13, 1920, established the Negro National League, the first successful organized black baseball league. The Negro Leagues would then go on to operate amazingly for 40 years, from 1920 until 1960. And as you could well imagine, that surprises so many of my visitors because they come in understanding that Jackie Robinson breaks the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947. And I think the basic assumption is, well, if Jackie breaks the color barrier in 1947, if there was a Negro League, surely it must have ended in and around that time. But the leagues operated for another 13 years. Why? Because it took Major League Baseball 12 years before every Major League team had at least one black baseball player. The Boston Red Sox were the last team to integrate in 1959 when they signed a ball player by the name of Elijah Pumpsie Green. That would complete the integration cycle. By 1960, the Negro League ceased operations because by then the best young black and brown stars had moved into the major leagues or into the minor league system, and there was no replenishing system.
The big question that historians have looked at over the year is, we all know what stars the white ball players were in Major League Baseball. What about the black ball players of their day? Were they as good? What's history's verdict on that?
Well, I'm going to say this the way that my dear friend and the founder of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum would say it very poignantly. I should say very succinctly, but very poignantly. We could play. And he wanted everybody to understand that they could play. And Steve, we carry a poster here in our gift shop at the museum that's, I think, surmises it so beautifully. It says 440 feet is 440 feet, no matter what color your skin. And so the idea and the notion that one's skin color could dictate their ability to play a game, well, we know that is ludicrous. And the Negro Leagues, from a talent standpoint, that league wouldn't take a backseat to any league. You had some of the greatest athletes to ever put on a baseball uniform competing there in the Negro Leagues, and you had a nucleus of both black and Hispanic talent that was playing the highest level in which black and brown could play in this country, that being the Negro Leagues.
Well, let's do a little education here. Everyone's heard of Babe Ruth, but not everyone's heard of Oscar Charleston, and we should know who he is. Tell us about him.
Yes, you should know who Oscar Charleston, whom again my dear friend, the late great Buck O'Neil, would say without hesitation, the greatest baseball player he ever saw. Now, he thought Willie Mays to be the greatest major leaguer. And Steve, most folks concur because Willie Mays could beat you every way in which you could be beaten. He could beat you with his bat. He could beat you with his arm, with his legs, with his glove. And of course, Willie Mays' illustrious professional baseball career began in the Negro Leagues as a 17-year-old patrolling center field for the Birmingham Black Barons. But Buck believed that Oscar Charleston to be the greatest baseball player he had ever seen. He saw pretty much all of the greats. Oscar Charleston was an early era Negro leaguer who could do everything. The consummate five-tool player. Hit for power, hit for average, could field, could run, could throw. In 1921, Oscar Charleston had one of the greatest baseball seasons, not in black baseball history, but in baseball history as a member then of the St. Louis Giants, when he led the Negro Leagues in home runs, triples, doubles, stolen bases, and batting average in the same season.
He was the Shohei Ohtani of his time, eh? Gotcha. Well, and I should say, we just put a picture up of Mr. Charleston while we were speaking, and you're right. He looks like he could play.
He could play. He was tenacious. You know, he was oftentimes described as having had the power of Babe Ruth, the defensive prowess of Tris Speaker, and the tenacity of Ty Cobb. Yeah, Oscar would fight you. Now, he usually wouldn't start the fight, but he would end the fight, all wrapped up into one dynamic package.
Well, for I guess about 50 years, statisticians have been scouring the old box scores and trying to gather the numbers that the black ball players put up a century ago. And earlier this year, Major League Baseball really came up with a very important decision on how to treat those statistics. Fill us in. What did they decide?
It was epic. It was a tremendous milestone, I dare say, not just for Negro League's history, black baseball history, but American history. And this goes back, Steve, to December 16th of 2020, when Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred made the historic announcement, first and foremost, that the major leagues were going to recognize the Negro League, certainly for what I already knew it to be, a major league, and that it would roll the records of the Negro Leagues into the record books of Major League Baseball. And on May 29th of this year, it became official. A dream team of Negro League historians and researchers worked diligently for the next 3+ years to kind of pull together the quantitative data that was necessary to essentially rewrite the pages of American history and include the Negro Leagues and their statistics in those record books of Major League Baseball. This was long overdue. And the reason that I say that is that very few folks realize that in 1969, Major League Baseball put together a commission to examine all of the professional baseball leagues that operated during the time that the National and American League operated. And those other leagues had been formally recognized by Major League Baseball. The Negro Leagues had been blatantly omitted. Yeah, they had been ignored. And so with one fell swoop of the pen, Commissioner Manfred essentially rewrote history to include the Negro Leagues. And I commend him for what he was so courageous to do, because he did what others could have done, but didn't do. And so on May 29th, all of a sudden, now you see the name of Josh Gibson, who you can make a legitimate case, the greatest hitter this game has ever seen. Because now his record, single season batting average of .466. And Steve, I'm going to step out on a limb and say, that one ain't going to be broken.
Well, okay, we've got a picture of Josh Gibson up right now.
Oh, yeah. And look at it, man.
I guess
the catcher.
Yeah, the point we need to make here is that for the longest time, if you asked a baseball fan who's the greatest average hitter of all time, you'd say Ty Cobb, because his .367 was recognized. Okay, if you take the Negro League stats into account, then Josh is number one now, is that right?
He is number one for single season batting record. He is number one for lifetime batting average of .372. And he's number one in on base percentage. And as the folks can see from that photograph, he was doing it as a catcher.
Amazing.
Catchers don't do that. No, you get power or maybe average, but rarely do you get the combination of the two. And look at the physique. I tell people, if you wanted to get an understanding of who Josh Gibson resembled physically, think the great Bo Jackson as a catcher, and you got Josh Gibson. But Bo couldn't hit the ball like Josh Gibson. Bo had plenty of power, but Gibson combined great power with great hitting ability. He is one of the greatest hitters this game has ever seen. So he was a great hitter with power, tremendous power.
I gather that baseball sabermetricians, as they're called, have scoured the universe looking for box scores, and they've only found about 75% of them. How much hope do you have that you'll be able to find, quote unquote, the rest of the story?
Oh, they will. They will. You know, it was an arduous task, you know, for what the work that these historians have done. But I go back to think about my friend Pete Gorton over at the Donaldson Network, where they've spent the last 20 years unearthing information about one ball player, the great John Donaldson. And John Donaldson, who will not be included in these numbers that we see that basically started from 1920 and went through 1948. John Donaldson did most of his work pre-Negro Leagues. But Steve, they've accounted for over 400 verifiable wins, over 5,000 strikeouts, and they're still unearthing information on just that one player. So you know that there's still much more out there to be ascertained. But the one thing that we know is that these numbers certainly provide an understanding of the talent that was there in the Negro Leagues, because those players like Willie Mays, Henry Aaron, Ernie Banks, who come out of the Negro Leagues and would be young stars in the major leagues. You know, they were young ball players in the Negro Leagues who became some of the major leagues' biggest stars. That's their lineage. It's not far-fetched. I know as much as people want to try to believe that because this league was primarily black folks, that it couldn't be as good as the league that had all these great white ball players. That's just not the case. It honestly, it makes no sense to even think that that would be the case. And we see the great success that those young ball players from the Negro Leagues had when they went into Major League Baseball. One of my favorite factoids relative to the immediate impact that the Negro Leagues had on Major League Baseball. From 1949 through 1959, 9 of 11 National League MVPs were former Negro League stars. Steve, these are not rookies of the year. We didn't even counting rookies of the year. We're talking MVPs. As my friend Buck could say, they could play.
I want to ask you about a little piece of punctuation. And humor me for a second as I set this up. You well remember that in 1961, when Roger Maris broke Babe Ruth's single-season home run record, they put a little asterisk beside Roger's 61 because they said, you got 162 games to make that record, whereas the Babe only had 154 games to set his previous record. Is there any danger of asterisks being placed beside these Negro League records?
It won't be asterisks placed by Major League Baseball. They will be formally and officially recognized amongst the greats of this game with no asterisk, just exactly what they accomplished in the games in which they competed and played in. Now, will others want to put asterisks by it? Maybe, perhaps, but it's okay. And that's okay. And that's the beauty of baseball. We continue to have these kinds of debates. I just encourage everybody who maybe believed that this league was inferior for some reason, come on over and see old Bob here at the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and walk through this place and get a clear understanding of the greatness of this league. No, they could indeed play, and they built a tremendous baseball enterprise that had far-reaching ramifications beyond the baseball field. But I'm thrilled that they are finally getting acknowledged in a way in which they should have been acknowledged years ago. And for the handful of Negro League players who are still with us and the families of those who have long gone, this was significant in so many ways.
I should ask you, in following up on that, this has been one of the great missions of your life, to have these men recognized and to have their statistics honored. How does victory taste?
Well, it tastes sweet. And for me, I don't know, Steve, if I've dwelled as much on the statistics, even though I know, and you alluded to this in the opening of this segment, baseball is a beautiful game of comparison and statistics. And the one thing that had kind of hampered, I guess, the mindset of those who had doubt about the Negro Leagues is that the statistics weren't readily available. And so now we've provided that statistical data that many of those needed to help them understand how good these players were in the Negro Leagues. But as typical, when you provide the stats, they say, well, that ain't enough. We need more. But, you know, for all of us, we're tremendously proud. And I am even more prouder of that team of historians and researchers who worked so diligently. I was part of the committee. I didn't do any research. Yeah, I dodged probability and statistics for about 3 years when I was in college. So they did not need my input in this whatsoever. But the team of historians and researchers who have dedicated themselves for doing this kind of work for some of them 20, 30 years or more. This was significant. And we are all very proud of that milestone moment that took place on May 29th when it became an official entry into the record books of Major League Baseball.
I'm going to perhaps inappropriately use my moderator's prerogative here to ask you a rather selfish question, which is my favorite ball player of all time is Ted Williams.
Yes.
And they always said about Ted, there goes the greatest hitter who ever lived. And, you know, you were telling me before we went on air, Ted Williams, who's kind of a crusty, curmudgeonly old guy for most of his career, but he was a champion of a black ball player. And I wonder if you could share that story.
He absolutely was. And Ted Williams, upon his own induction into the National Baseball Hall of Fame, used his platform defiantly to advocate for the inclusion of Negro League players to be inducted into the National Baseball Hall of Fame. Steve, as he would go on to say, as symbols of those great black stars who weren't there because they'd never been given a chance. 5 years later, Satchel Paige becomes the first from the Negro Leagues who went in solely for his Negro Leagues career. Now, Jackie Robinson was already in, but Jackie went in for his Major League career, even though his baseball career, professional baseball career, began in the Negro Leagues. This does not happen without Ted Williams' advocacy. You needed a star player to push this agenda because the average Joe ball player, no one was going to pay any attention. And of course, as we discussed off camera, Ted Williams was of Mexican-American descent. So he had a heart for this, and he had competed with and against those players, particularly in many of those Spanish-speaking countries. Because when they played winter ball, there was no separation. They all played together. So the major leaguers knew that these guys could play. It was just simply the social conditions of our time and fear that kept them out of the major leagues. And I always preface the word fear because I don't think the superstar major leaguer was ever concerned about integration. Ted Williams wasn't concerned about integration, Steve, because Ted Williams could play. It was that average major leaguer that was concerned about integration because if you allow this influx of both black and brown talent in, I might lose my job. You know, when Jackie Robinson came up in 1947, guess what? He took somebody's job, and he took the job of a teammate's friend. And that was the overarching concern is what would happen if you open the door and all of this talent can just move freely into the major leagues.
You know, I think probably the best place to end this conversation is to have you tell us a story about your great friend, Buck O'Neil, who was one of the truly great ambassadors of baseball and a very funny guy. Can you hit us up with a funny Buck O'Neil story?
Well, one of my favorite Buck O'Neil stories of many, and he would oftentimes tell this story. He's playing as a member of Satchel Paige and his Satchel Paige All-Stars, and they're playing in the Denver Post tournament, and they're playing against an all-white semi-pro team. And so Buck says the first kid from the Coors dugout gets into the batter's box. He digs in. Satchel throws him a fastball. Kid swung as hard as he could, Steve. Topped it, dribbled it down the third base line. It stays fair. He beats it out, gets an infield hit. Well, about that time, Buck says one of the kids on the Coors team steps out on top of the dugout steps. And he yells out, "Let's beat him. He ain't nothing but an overrated donkey." Well, Satchel Paige, Steve, Satchel was probably more offended by being called overrated than he was by being called a donkey. And he looks over at first base, and Satchel has a nickname for everybody. And his nickname, famously for Buck O'Neil, was Nancy. And that's a whole nother story. We ain't got time to tell that story. He looks over at first base. He says, "Nancy, did you hear that?" Buck said, "Yes, Satchel, I heard him." He said, "Nancy, bring him in." So Buck is playing first base. He turns and motions for the outfield to take a couple steps in. Satchel looks over at first base. He says, "Nancy, bring him all the way in." Honest to God's truth. There were 7 guys kneeling around the mound. Satchel Paige and the catcher, and Satchel strikes out the side on 9 straight pitches. He says Satchel looks into the Coors dugout and says, overrated darky hay. And of course, by now, the kid that said this, he was embarrassed. They were all crying, and all the guys came out to apologize to Satchel and his teammates. But Buck O'Neil swore to the day he died that if he had one game to win and any choice of any pitcher from any era, it would be the legendary Leroy Satchel Paige. As Buck would say, you might beat him when he was out there messing around, but when he was locked and loaded, forget about it.
That's a fantastic story. And I got to tell you, I know the Nancy story, and people should look that one up because that's hilarious too.
It is hilarious.
That is a great story. Mr. Kendrick, I want to recommend 2 things before we go. Number one, you do a podcast called Black Diamonds, which I'm a big fan of, and I listen to all the time. I heard your interview with Andre Dawson the other day, and I would encourage people to go look that up, Black Diamonds, the podcast, and of course, your Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City, Missouri, which is on my bucket list, and I got to get there before I push up daisies, and I will.
Yeah. So, and you got to get here because we're getting ready to build a new one. So you got to see the old one and then come and see the new one. Of course, we got to raise about $30 million to build this new one. But we did announce plans to build a new 30,000+ square foot Negro Leagues Baseball Museum that's going to be built right around the corner from where we're currently operating the Negro Leagues Museum now. And I'm really excited about this next phase of growth for our museum and what that means for really the baseball world, to have this wonderful edifice known as the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum as the gateway into historic 18th and Vine here in Kansas City. So, man, I look forward to seeing you. And when you come, the ribs are on me.
That's very generous of you. I can't wait to shake your hand and see all of your great work. Thank you for joining us on TVO tonight. And, yeah, they could play. You're damn right they could play.
They could play. Thank you, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, October 8th, 2024. Tomorrow on the program, war in the Middle East. What will it take to end one of the world's most intractable conflicts? Hope you'll join us for that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
We are where you are. TVO's current affairs journalism is available across platforms across Ontario, on Roku, Amazon Fire, Apple TV, and more. Catch The Agenda, The Thread, On Poly, and other podcasts, docs, and video series on the device of your choice when you choose.